Every morning, millions of people make a seemingly simple choice. Some pour coffee into their cup, prepare breakfast, and start their day as usual. Others do the exact opposite. They look at the clock, ignore their hunger, and continue working for hours without putting a single bite of food in their mouths. For them, that emptiness in their stomach doesn't represent a problem, it represents a strategy. The promise seems irresistible: to lose weight without constantly counting calories, to improve blood sugar levels, to give the body a rest, and even to activate natural cell renewal mechanisms that many have come to call a kind of internal cleansing of the body. But at the same time, another story circulates with the same intensity. Some say that skipping meals slows down metabolism, that the body goes into survival mode, that going many hours without eating causes muscle loss, reduces energy, and can even increase food cravings. Two completely different narratives. Curiously, both seem to find people willing to swear they work. Meanwhile, thousands of videos, books, and social media posts have transformed intermittent fasting into much more than just a dietary strategy. It has come to represent almost a philosophy of life. For some, it's a tool capable of revolutionizing health. For others, it's just another nutritional fad destined to disappear when the next trend emerges. But there's an important detail that rarely appears in the headlines. For many years, much of the claim about fasting was based on hypotheses, individual experiences, or studies conducted mainly on animals. The results were promising, but still insufficient to answer the questions that really matter to those who live an ordinary life. What happens inside the human body when we go hours without eating? At what point does the body stop using glucose and begin to rely more intensely on fat reserves? Does the much-discussed autophagy really occur as many claim? Does metabolism slow down or continue to function normally? Does fasting offer its own benefits, or do its results appear only because people end up consuming fewer calories throughout the day? And perhaps the most important question of all: if fasting really works, why do some people report more energy, easier weight loss, and improved test results, while others experience fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and end up abandoning the strategy a few weeks later? Answering these questions requires going back in time, long before diets, calorie-counting apps, and modern nutritional recommendations. Humans already went for long periods without eating. Not because they chose to, but simply because food wasn't always available. For almost all of human history, food abundance was an exception. The human body evolved in an environment marked by alternating periods of plenty and scarcity. Survival meant developing mechanisms capable of functioning even when the next meal was uncertain. Perhaps this is precisely where one of the biggest clues lies in understanding why fasting arouses so much interest in current science. In recent years, universities and research centers around the world have begun to investigate this practice with much more rigor. Clinical trials, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses have begun to replace opinions with evidence. Some widely disseminated ideas have been confirmed. Others have needed to be revised, and several questions remain without a definitive answer. The most interesting thing is that the conclusion doesn't favor either extreme. Neither is fasting a miracle solution capable of transforming anyone into a paragon of health, nor can it be dismissed as a simple fad without scientific basis. Reality, as is often the case in science, is much more complex and also much more interesting. Throughout this investigation, we will follow the trajectory of fasting from the earliest civilizations to modern laboratories. We will understand how the body reacts to the temporary absence of food, what really happens to hormones like insulin, glucagon, and ghrelin, what the role of autophagy is, why the biological clock so greatly influences the results, and, above all, what the best scientific evidence has actually confirmed after years of debate. Because, in the end, perhaps the question has never been whether intermittent fasting works. The real question is, for whom, under what conditions, and why? It is this answer that we will begin to build now, going back thousands of years in history to discover how humanity's relationship with food has shaped the functioning of our own metabolism. Imagine waking up 10,000 years ago. There are no refrigerators, no supermarkets, no clock marking breakfast time. The first meal of the day depends on something far more uncertain: finding food. Sometimes the hunt is successful, sometimes not. Some days there is plenty. On others, only waiting. For most of human evolutionary history, eating was not an organized habit of 3 daily meals and 2 snacks. It was an opportunity. The organism needed to function both during periods of abundance and during hours, or even days, of scarcity. This reality left deep marks on our biology. Over millions of years, the human body developed extremely sophisticated systems to cope with the temporary absence of food. The energy stored in the form of glycogen and fat does not exist by chance. It represents a survival mechanism shaped by natural selection. If our metabolism collapsed a few hours after the last meal, the species would hardly have survived. In fact, the ability to switch between different energy sources was one of the great evolutionary advantages of humankind. When food was available, the body stored some of that energy for the future. When food disappeared, it began to use these reserves in a way carefully regulated by hormones and metabolic signals. This process was not an emergency. It was the body's normal functioning. This perspective completely changes how we view fasting. Today, many people believe that going a few hours without eating is unnatural. But from an evolutionary point of view, perhaps the opposite situation is more unusual. Living for decades with constant access to food, practically every hour of the day. And this change happened very recently. For thousands of years, even after the emergence of agriculture, food availability remained limited by seasons, harvests, weather conditions, and storage difficulties. It was only in the last few centuries, and especially in the last few decades, that a significant portion of the population began to live with a virtually uninterrupted supply of food. For the first time in history, it became possible to eat without being hungry. Just open a cupboard, order from a delivery app, go to a convenience store, or simply consuming ultra-processed foods that remain available all the time. This transformation has profoundly altered our habits. Meals have ceased to be merely moments to fulfill physiological needs. They have become social, cultural, and emotional events, and often automatic responses to stress, boredom, or anxiety. At the same time, another phenomenon has gained strength. The food industry has perfected highly palatable products, rich in combinations of sugar, fat, and salt, that stimulate the brain's reward centers. This doesn't mean that these foods are, by themselves, solely responsible for modern metabolic problems, but they have facilitated a much more frequent consumption of calories than that for which our biology evolved. Meanwhile, the concept of snacking all day has begun to be seen as a healthy habit in many contexts. For decades, popular recommendations encouraged frequent meals with the idea of keeping the metabolism accelerated. Today, however, research shows that this relationship is much more complex. Daily energy expenditure depends much more on the total amount of food ingested, the composition of the diet, muscle mass, and physical activity, than simply on the number of meals. This discovery led many researchers to revisit an old question. Does the body benefit from scheduled periods without food intake? Interestingly, this idea was not new. Long before modern science, different civilizations already used fasting. In ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and various religious traditions, periods of food abstinence were associated with discipline, spirituality, or health recovery. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, observed that temporarily reducing food intake could be useful in certain diseases, although his explanations were limited by the knowledge of the time. For centuries, fasting remained mainly linked to culture and religion. It was only in the 20th century that researchers began to study it systematically. Initially, the focus was on understanding how the body survived the lack of food. Then came research on obesity, diabetes, energy metabolism, and aging. One of the first major advances was realizing that the body does not simply shut down when the last meal ends. There is an organized sequence of adaptations. In the first few hours, glucose from the meal still circulates in the blood. Then, the body begins to use glycogen stored mainly in the liver. As this stock decreases, the use of fat as an energy source gradually increases. None of this happens abruptly. It is a carefully coordinated transition by hormones such as insulin and glucagon. Decades later, another topic began to attract the attention of the scientific community: autophagy. Laboratory experiments showed that, under certain conditions, cells activated internal recycling mechanisms, removing damaged components and reusing materials to maintain their function. The discovery sparked enormous enthusiasm and opened new lines of research on aging and disease. But there was a problem. Much of this evidence came from studies in yeast, worms, flies, and mice. Translating these results to humans was much more difficult than it seemed. Even today, this is one of the areas that generates the most exaggerated interpretations on social media. While some have claimed that any fasting triggers intense cellular cleansing, researchers continue to investigate exactly how long food restriction would be necessary, which tissues respond in this way, and to what extent the results observed in animal models are actually replicated in humans. This difference between popular enthusiasm and scientific evidence has become one of the biggest characteristics of the debate about fasting. While some findings were promising, others showed that the body's response depends on numerous factors: age, body composition, diet quality, exercise, fasting duration, genetics, sleep, and even the time of day meals are consumed. It was precisely this complexity that transformed intermittent fasting into one of the most researched topics in modern nutrition. But to understand why results vary so much among people, we first need to understand what really happens inside the body during the hours when it stops receiving food. It is at this point that many of the most repeated myths begin to fall apart, and where science reveals mechanisms that few people know. The clock marks 2 hours since the last meal. For most people, nothing seems different. The feeling is that the body continues exactly the same. But behind the scenes, an impressive sequence of metabolic adjustments has already begun. Contrary to what many imagine, the body doesn't wait until hunger strikes to change how it produces energy. These adaptations begin long before any discomfort appears. Right after a meal, the main source of fuel is glucose from food. Insulin increases to facilitate the entry of this glucose into cells, allowing it to be used immediately or stored for later use. This is a completely normal process. In fact, insulin is not a villain. Without it, it would be impossible to adequately control blood sugar levels. The problem arises when this dynamic ceases to function efficiently. As the hours pass and digestion ends, insulin levels naturally begin to decrease. At the same time, another hormone takes center stage: glucagon. While insulin signals abundance, glucagon tells the body that it's time to resort to energy reserves. The first of these is glycogen. Few people have heard of it, but this reserve functions like a fast-charging battery. The liver stores glucose in the form of glycogen and releases it gradually to maintain stable blood sugar levels between meals. This is why most people can go several hours without eating and continue thinking, walking, and working normally. The body was prepared for this long before any fasting protocol existed. But this reserve is not infinite. As time passes, especially during longer fasts or after physical exercise, liver glycogen decreases. It is at this point that one of the most interesting metabolic changes occurs. The use of fat as fuel progressively increases. This process is often simplified on social media with phrases like, "the body has entered fat-burning mode." While the idea has a grain of truth, it is much more gradual than these explanations suggest. In reality, the body uses carbohydrates and fats simultaneously throughout almost the entire day. What changes is the proportion between these energy sources. As insulin remains low and glycogen decreases, the contribution of fat to energy production increases. This does not mean that a person will automatically start losing weight just because they have gone a few hours without eating. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about intermittent fasting. Losing body fat depends, over time, on an energy balance compatible with that goal. Fasting can facilitate this process for some people because it reduces opportunities to eat and helps control calorie intake. But if more calories are consumed during the eating window than the body needs, weight loss may simply not occur. This is perhaps one of the most important conclusions of recent research. Fasting is a strategy, not an exception to the laws of physiology. Another widespread myth involves the so-called starvation mode. According to this idea, simply going a few hours without eating would cause the metabolism to slow down drastically as a way to conserve energy. Science shows a different scenario. During short fasts, such as the 12, 14, or 16-hour protocols, energy expenditure tends to remain quite stable in most healthy people. In some studies, a slight temporary increase in the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, hormones that help mobilize energy reserves and maintain alertness, is even observed. The significant reduction in metabolism is much more associated with prolonged weight loss, severe caloric restriction for long periods, or malnutrition than with simply delaying a meal. Another frequent concern relates to muscle mass. If I don't eat, my body will consume my muscles. This statement contains a grain of truth, but again, context makes all the difference. The body does recycle proteins continuously. This happens every day, even when we eat regularly. While some proteins are broken down, others are produced. It's a dynamic process. During longer fasts, protein breakdown can increase at certain times. However, in common intermittent fasting protocols, especially when there is adequate protein intake and strength training, research indicates that muscle mass preservation is usually quite satisfactory. In other words, it's not just the period without eating that determines this result. The quality of the diet, training, and protein intake play much larger roles, but perhaps the most misunderstood character in this story is hunger. Many people imagine that it grows continuously until it becomes unbearable. In practice, this rarely happens. The sensation of hunger is regulated by a complex set of hormones and signals sent between the gut, adipose tissue, and the brain. Among them is ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone. Interestingly, ghrelin does not increase linearly. It usually peaks around the times when a person is accustomed to eating. If no meal occurs, these peaks often decrease again sometime later. That's why some people report feeling very hungry at 8 in the morning. But if they go past that time, they notice that the feeling temporarily weakens. This doesn't mean the hunger has disappeared. It just means that it's much more influenced by habits and the biological clock than we usually imagine. This phenomenon helps explain why many individuals manage to adapt to fasting after a few weeks, while others continue to face difficulties. There is no universal answer. Adaptation depends on routine, genetics, previous eating patterns, sleep, stress levels, and even the composition of meals consumed during the eating window. But there is a topic that has sparked even greater interest among scientists and the public: autophagy. Few words have gained so much popularity in recent years. It has come to be presented as an almost magical mechanism of cellular renewal. In theory, during periods of scarcity, cells begin to identify defective proteins, aged organelles, and damaged components, recycling this material to maintain their efficient functioning. It's a fascinating discovery, and it really exists, so much so that it earned the 2016 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for Japanese researcher Yoshinori Osumi for his fundamental contributions to understanding this biological process. However, here arises one of the biggest differences between scientific dissemination and scientific evidence. Much of what we know about autophagy comes from studies conducted on experimental models. Measuring this phenomenon directly in different human tissues is much more complex. There is still no consensus capable of stating exactly after how many hours of fasting this process increases in a clinically relevant way in healthy people. This means that categorically stating that 16 hours of fasting activates autophagy, or that there is a magic number valid for everyone, oversimplifies a much more complex reality. Science is still building these answers. And perhaps this is precisely the most important characteristic of this topic. The more researchers investigate intermittent fasting, the less room there is for absolute certainties. But at the same time, some conclusions have begun to appear repeatedly in high-quality clinical studies. After years of debate, comparisons, and hundreds of published studies, the scientific community has finally managed to answer several of the questions that seemed impossible at the beginning of this investigation. And that's exactly where the story gets even more interesting. For a long time, the debate about intermittent fasting seemed like a clash between two absolute certainties. On one side, there were those who presented it as the greatest revolution in modern nutrition. Simply reducing the eating window would lead to weight loss, disease prevention, cell rejuvenation, and longer life. On the other, there were those who completely dismissed the strategy, claiming it was nothing more than a fad with no advantage over traditional diets. But science rarely works that way. It doesn't seek to confirm beliefs. It tests hypotheses, compares results, and often reveals a reality far less extreme than we imagined. In the last 15 years, the number of studies on intermittent fasting has grown impressively. Researchers have gathered hundreds of clinical trials, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses to answer a simple question. When we put real people on fasting protocols, what really happens? The first answer came on the topic that arouses the most interest: weight loss. The results showed something that surprised both proponents and critics. On average, people who practice intermittent fasting do manage to lose weight. This is a fact observed in several studies. But there is a crucial detail. When researchers compare groups that consume the same total amount of calories, one using intermittent fasting and the other distributing those calories throughout the day, the differences in weight loss are usually small or non-existent. This means that fasting doesn't seem to defy the laws of metabolism. It works mainly because it helps many people eat less spontaneously. By reducing the eating window, it also reduces the opportunities to consume extra calories. For someone who used to snack at night or have frequent snacks without realizing it, this simple change can represent hundreds of fewer calories per day. But not everyone responds the same way. Some people arrive at mealtime with such an appetite that they end up completely compensating for the calories they stop consuming during fasting. In these cases, the advantage practically disappears. This was one of the first major lessons of science. Fasting facilitates a calorie deficit for some people, but it doesn't create a metabolic shortcut. The second major theme was insulin resistance. Insulin is the hormone responsible for helping glucose enter cells. When the body becomes less responsive to this hormone, the pancreas needs to produce increasingly larger amounts to keep blood glucose under control. This process is related to the development of type 2 diabetes and various metabolic disorders. Several studies have shown that intermittent fasting can improve insulin sensitivity, especially in overweight or obese individuals. This occurs because the loss of body fat reduces a series of inflammatory processes and improves metabolic function. However, once again, researchers observed that much of this benefit accompanies weight loss itself. In other words, it is not only fasting that produces this improvement. Traditional diets that promote weight loss also tend to show similar results. This does not diminish the importance of fasting. On the contrary, it shows that it can be an efficient tool to achieve this goal, provided it is sustainable for the individual. Another point that aroused enormous interest was cardiovascular health. Recent meta-analyses indicate that intermittent fasting may contribute to small reductions in blood pressure, triglyceride levels, and, in some cases, LDL cholesterol, especially when accompanied by weight loss and improved diet quality. These effects are promising, but vary considerably between studies. This is because different protocols produce different results. Some research uses 12-hour fasts, others 16 hours. Some evaluate time-restricted eating. Others investigate alternate day fasting. Not all of these methods generate the same physiological effects. This diversity makes it difficult to establish a single conclusion valid for all. Then came perhaps the most fascinating question of all: longevity. Experiments in animals have shown that different forms of food restriction can increase life expectancy in certain species. These results generated enormous enthusiasm, but there is a fundamental difference. Mice are not human beings. Their metabolism is much faster. Their life cycle is completely different. Interventions that work in animals do not always produce the same effects in people. To date, there is no robust evidence that intermittent fasting directly increases human longevity. What does exist are indications of improvements in factors associated with healthy aging, such as glycemic control, body composition, and some metabolic markers. This is an important distinction. Science cannot yet say that fasting will make someone live longer, but it can say that, in certain contexts, this strategy can improve conditions related to metabolic health. And then we come to the topic that has perhaps been most widely discussed on social media: autophagy. After cellular recycling mechanisms gained prominence in basic research, many people began to treat autophagy as a switch that would automatically turn on after a certain number of hours without eating. The reality is much more sophisticated. Autophagy occurs continuously in different tissues of the body. It is not an event that simply starts from scratch during a fast. What research suggests is that certain metabolic conditions can increase its activity in some tissues. However, we still do not know exactly what duration of fasting would be necessary to produce clinically relevant effects in humans, nor whether these effects vary according to age, sex, body composition, or health status. This is one of the most promising areas of current science, and also one of the most misunderstood outside of laboratories. Another important point involves inflammation. Some studies have identified reductions in inflammatory markers after fasting protocols, mainly in individuals with obesity or metabolic syndrome. Again, part of this effect seems to be linked to body fat loss and improved overall diet. This leads us to a conclusion that appears repeatedly in virtually all scientific reviews. Fasting does not work in isolation. If the eating window is filled with ultra-processed foods, excess sugar, little fiber, and low protein intake, many of the expected benefits are considerably diminished. In other words, it's not enough to ask how long do you go without eating. It's equally important to ask, what do you eat when the fast ends? Perhaps this is one of the biggest corrections that science has brought to the debate. For years, much attention was devoted to the period without food. Today, we know that the quality of food remains one of the most important factors for health. Fasting does not replace a balanced diet. It can enhance good habits, but it will hardly compensate for bad habits. Another aspect revealed by research concerns adherence. A dietary strategy only works if it can be maintained for months or years, and here, fasting presents an interesting behavior. Some people report that it completely simplifies their routine. They feel less need to think about food, can better control their appetite, and maintain the plan easily. Others experience the opposite. They feel irritability, decreased physical performance, difficulty concentrating, or episodes of binge eating at the end of the fast. None of these experiences are necessarily wrong. They show something fundamental. The human body does not respond identically in all people. It is precisely this variability that explains why two individuals can follow exactly the same protocol and obtain completely different results. But what determines this difference? Why do some people seem to adapt almost naturally to fasting, while others face a huge challenge from the first days? The answer lies in factors that go far beyond the clock, involving hormones, sleep, stress, circadian rhythm, genetics, and daily habits. It is this connection that we will begin to unravel in the next chapter. It's easy to imagine that the success of intermittent fasting depends only on willpower. Just look at the clock, resist hunger, and wait for the benefits to appear. But this explanation ignores one of the most fascinating aspects of human biology. Our bodies don't work like a stopwatch. They work like an orchestra. Millions of chemical signals, hormones, and biological rhythms work together to decide when we feel hungry, when we store energy, when we burn fat, and even when we are most prepared to metabolize food. That's why two people can follow the exact same fasting protocol and have completely different experiences. Imagine two individuals who adopt a 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. eating window. The first sleeps well, does weight training, consumes enough protein, works regular hours, and maintains a diet rich in vegetables, fruits, legumes, and minimally processed foods. The second sleeps few hours a night, lives under constant stress, spends the day sitting, eats in a hurry, and when it's time to break the fast, has a meal rich in ultra-processed foods and sugary drinks. Both fasted for the same amount of time, but their bodies received completely different messages. This is one of the reasons why science insists on analyzing the context and not just the duration of the fast. One of the protagonists in this story is the circadian rhythm. Long before electricity existed, the human body evolved synchronized with daylight. Almost all cells possess an internal clock that regulates processes such as hormone production, body temperature, digestion, and glucose metabolism. This means that the body does not respond in the same way to a meal at 8 in the morning and at midnight. Several studies suggest that insulin sensitivity tends to be higher during the early morning and decreases as the night progresses. In other words, for many people, the body handles carbohydrates better during the daytime than in the hours close to sleep. This knowledge gave rise to a strategy known as early time restricted feeding, in which the eating window occurs earlier, following the natural biological rhythm. Initial results are promising, with improvements in some metabolic markers, even when weight loss is small. However, this model can be difficult to reconcile with the social and professional routines of many people, showing once again that the best strategy is the one that can be maintained. Sleep also plays a decisive role. A single night of poor sleep can increase the production of ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates hunger, and reduce levels of leptin, which contributes to the feeling of satiety. In practice, this means that sleeping too little can make fasting much more difficult. Not because the person has less discipline, but because their brain is receiving biological signals that increase the desire for food, especially those rich in sugar and fat. Stress follows a similar logic. When we face stressful situations, the body releases cortisol, a hormone essential for our survival. In small doses and for short periods, it helps the body respond to challenges. But when stress becomes chronic, elevated cortisol levels can increase appetite, make it difficult to control blood sugar, and favor less healthy food choices. In this scenario, trying to maintain a strict fasting protocol can be much more challenging. Another factor often ignored is the quality of the first meal after fasting. Imagine two people ending a 16-hour fast. The first opts for eggs, natural yogurt, fruit, oatmeal, and nuts. This combination provides protein, fiber, healthy fats, and slower digesting carbohydrates, promoting satiety and a gradual release of energy. The second option breaks the fast with soda, fried snacks, sweets, or large amounts of ultra-processed foods. Although the initial sensation is pleasurable, the glycemic response tends to be more intense, followed by a faster drop in glucose, favoring the early return of hunger in some people. The contrast between these two situations shows that fasting does not negate the impact of eating. It only changes when it happens. Exercise also profoundly influences the experience. For those who perform light or moderate workouts, exercising on an empty stomach can be comfortable and even convenient. Some people report a feeling of lightness and good disposition. However, high-intensity activities, such as sprints or very demanding weight training sessions, can be impaired in some individuals when performed after many hours without eating, especially if there is low carbohydrate consumption in the routine. Again, there is no universal rule. Performance depends on the type of exercise, the level of training, adaptation to fasting, and the goals of each person. Another important aspect is body composition. Individuals with a higher percentage of body fat tend to have more abundant energy reserves, which can facilitate periods of fasting. Very thin people, high-performance athletes, or individuals with high energy demands may find it more difficult to maintain long intervals without food. Age also deserves attention. Although healthy adults can benefit from fasting in certain circumstances, older adults have a higher risk of muscle mass loss and may need a more frequent distribution of protein throughout the day. Similarly, children and adolescents are in a growth phase and have specific nutritional needs. There are also groups for whom fasting should be evaluated very carefully or avoided, such as pregnant women, breastfeeding women, people with a history of eating disorders, and individuals using medications that can cause hypoglycemia. In these cases, changes in eating habits should be monitored by healthcare professionals. All this reinforces an essential idea. Intermittent fasting is not a test of endurance, but a tool that needs to respect the characteristics of the person using it. When it becomes a source of guilt, anxiety, or constant suffering, it is likely that the strategy is not suitable for that person's reality. On the other hand, when integrated naturally into the routine, without obsession and without compromising the quality of the diet, it can represent a practical way to organize meals and improve adherence to a healthy lifestyle. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson that science has offered us so far. The clock matters, but it never works alone. Metabolism is influenced by what we eat, when we eat, how much we sleep, how we move, and even how we deal with daily stress. Understanding this interaction allows us to abandon simplistic solutions and see fasting for what it really is, a strategy that can work very well in certain contexts, but that does not need to and should not be seen as the only answer for everyone. Now that we understand why the results vary so much between people, it's time to answer the most practical question of this entire investigation: how to apply this knowledge safely in a balanced and evidence-based way. After traversing thousands of years of history, understanding the mechanisms of metabolism, and analyzing what studies actually demonstrate, one conclusion becomes inevitable. The question should never be, does intermittent fasting work? The correct question is, does intermittent fasting work for my reality? This small change in perspective makes all the difference, because when science is observed carefully, it doesn't offer a single recipe. It offers tools for each person to make more conscious choices. The first step is to abandon the idea that the longer the time without eating, the greater the benefits. This logic seems intuitive, but it doesn't find consistent support in research. Many people start with extremely long protocols, believing that they will accelerate results. In the first few days, they manage to maintain discipline. Then, dizziness, irritability, decreased physical performance, episodes of binge eating, and an increasingly stressful relationship with food appear. The problem in these cases wasn't the fasting itself. It was the expectation that more always means better. In practice, moderate protocols tend to be more sustainable. For those who want to try this strategy, gradually increasing the interval between dinner and breakfast can already represent a significant change. Instead of eating late into the night and having their first meal as soon as they wake up, Some people simply eliminate late-night snacks and delay breakfast a little. Without being radical, they can go 12 hours or a little more without consuming calories. It may seem like a short time compared to the promises seen on social media, but this interval already allows for a period of digestive rest and, above all, is usually much easier to incorporate into a routine. Consistency almost always produces better results than extreme strategies followed by frequent setbacks. Another key point is how to break the fast. After several hours without eating, the body doesn't need a sugar rush or a large amount of ultra-processed foods. A balanced meal tends to offer a more stable metabolic response. Good quality proteins help maintain muscle mass and promote satiety. Foods rich in fiber, such as fruits, vegetables, legumes, oats, and pulses, contribute to a more gradual increase in blood glucose. Unsaturated fats present in nuts, seeds, olive oil, and avocado complement this meal nutritiously. In other words, the end of the fast is not a reward for having endured. It is simply the beginning of another meal that should follow the same principles of a healthy diet. Hydration also deserves attention. Although traditional fasting only involves the absence of caloric foods, water remains essential. Coffee and tea without sugar are also commonly used by many people during the fasting period, provided there are no individual contraindications. Maintaining good fluid intake helps reduce symptoms such as headaches and fatigue, especially in the first weeks of adaptation. Another frequently neglected aspect is protein consumption throughout the eating window. Those who practice weight training or wish to preserve muscle mass need to ensure adequate intake of this nutrient throughout the day. Fasting does not eliminate this need. On the contrary, it makes it even more important to plan meals capable of meeting individual recommendations. Physical exercise can also be adjusted according to each person's experience. If training while fasting causes dizziness, decreased performance, or persistent discomfort, it may be more beneficial to perform the activity after a meal. On the other hand, if training is comfortable and performance remains adequate, there is no reason to believe that exercising while fasting is necessarily harmful to everyone. The best schedule is one that allows for regularity and safety. It's also worth remembering that not all initial discomfort means the body is detoxifying or undergoing a special adaptation process. Intense weakness, fainting, excessive weight loss, significant mood swings, or repeated episodes of hypoglycemia are signs that something is wrong and deserve professional evaluation. The body sends messages all the time. Learning to listen to them is much smarter than trying to overcome them. There's also an important issue regarding personality and behavior. Some people appreciate simple rules. For them, setting a clear time to start and end meals reduces anxiety and facilitates food control. Others feel the exact opposite. Turning the clock into a rigid rule increases constant worry about food, generates guilt when the protocol isn't followed, and can harm the relationship with food. None of these reactions is a sign of success or failure. They are simply different ways of responding to the same strategy. That's why healthcare professionals often emphasize individualization. A nutritional intervention is only truly effective when it respects the biological, emotional, and social characteristics of the person. The same protocol that works very well for one individual may be completely inadequate for another. Another important lesson is that fasting does not replace fundamental habits. It does not compensate for sleepless nights. It does not neutralize the effects of a sedentary lifestyle. It does not eliminate the consequences of smoking. It does not automatically correct a diet rich in ultra-processed foods. The greatest benefits observed in studies appear when fasting is part of a set of healthy behaviors. This is perhaps the most important point of the entire investigation. For years, the debate has been conducted as if there were a single food, supplement, or protocol capable of solving extremely complex problems on its own. But the human body does not work that way. Health is the result of the interaction between numerous factors that accumulate over time. Fasting can be one of those pieces. Important in some cases, unnecessary in others, but never the only one. And after understanding all this, we arrive at the moment to definitively answer the question that opened this documentary. After years of research, what can we really say about intermittent fasting? This conclusion brings together all the evidence, dispels the main misconceptions, and shows how science views this practice today. When this investigation began, there was only one question. Does intermittent fasting really work? Or is it all just a fad fueled by social media? After tracing the history of humanity, understanding how metabolism evolved, analyzing the role of hormones, and following what the best scientific studies have discovered, the answer finally appears. And it is much more interesting than a simple yes or no. Intermittent fasting is not a magic formula, nor is it a myth. It is a tool. Like any tool, its value depends on how it is used and the person using it. Science has confirmed that scheduled periods without food can promote weight loss, improve some metabolic markers, and contribute to blood glucose control, especially when they help reduce excessive calorie consumption and are accompanied by a quality diet. It has also shown that many promises made around fasting have been exaggerated. To date, there is no robust evidence that simply going hours without eating increases human longevity or predictably and measurably activates processes like autophagy in all people, as is often reported. This does not diminish the importance of the findings. On the contrary, it shows that science prefers to advance cautiously, recognizing what it already knows and, above all, what it is still investigating. Perhaps this is the biggest difference between scientific knowledge and popular opinion. Science does not seek easy answers. It seeks reliable answers. And this investigation revealed something that goes far beyond fasting. For decades, we have been led to seek isolated solutions to complex problems. A miracle food, a revolutionary supplement, a definitive diet. But the human organism has never worked that way. Our health is built by choices that are repeated daily. Sleeping well, moving the body, controlling stress, consuming nutrient-rich foods, maintaining a good amount of protein, fiber, fruits, vegetables, and legumes. Avoiding excess ultra-processed foods. And for some people, organizing meals within a specific eating window can be an efficient way to make these habits easier to follow. For others, it isn't, and that's okay. The best nutritional strategy isn't the one that promises the fastest results. It's the one that can be maintained for years without causing suffering, guilt, or a negative relationship with food. Ultimately, the real goal was never to go longer without eating. It was to learn to eat better when mealtimes finally arrive. Before concluding, it's worth remembering 5 lessons that summarize everything we've seen so far. First, intermittent fasting can be an effective tool, but it doesn't replace a balanced diet. Second, weight loss still largely depends on the balance between energy consumed and energy expended over time. Third, the quality of food matters as much as the time it's consumed. Fourth, there is no ideal protocol for everyone. Age, routine, health, preferences, and individual goals make a difference. Fifth, be wary of absolute promises. In nutrition, the best answers are almost always more complex than the slogans found on the internet. Perhaps the greatest benefit of this documentary isn't convincing you to practice fasting. Whether you adopt it or discard it, the decision should be based on quality information, not fads. Because knowing how your body really works is much more valuable than following any trend. If this content helped clarify doubts that have surrounded this topic for so many years, share this video with someone who is also trying to understand what is fact and what is exaggeration when it comes to food and health. Leave your comment telling us about your experience with intermittent fasting. Have you tried it? Did it work for you, or did you encounter difficulties? Your experience can enrich the conversation and help other people. If you like documentaries that combine science, history, and investigation to explain the major health topics in a clear and evidence-based way, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way, you won't miss the next content. And in the next documentary, we will investigate another issue that generates intense debate. Does counting calories still make sense? Or is the quality of food much more important than the numbers on the plate? Until then, remember, the best health decisions rarely come from extreme solutions. They come from the combination of good evidence, critical thinking, and small, consistent habits, repeated day after day. After all, it is this consistency and not a single protocol that, over time, truly transforms health.